We broadcast from the unceded lands of the Yuggera and Turrbal peoples in Magan-djin, so-called Brisbane. We pay our respects to the rightful owners of these lands and waters, and to all First Nations communities across the continent, as they continue their struggle for land back, liberation, and a permanent end to colonial occupation. From every river to every sea, we know that Indigenous sovereignty must be respected, and that land back must sit at the centre of all of our political work.
Mutual, mutual, la mutual, mutual, la. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
What we are witnessing is the exposure of lies, that colonization is neither benevolent or non-violent.
To understand the resistance would be to understand settler colonialism, for which mainstream media is intimately entwined with the state in this country.
Everything we do here, everything we do is really
Our revolution will never be found in states, in governments, in courts, but it will be found in each other.
Hello and welcome to Radio Reversal. I'm Anna and I'm so excited to be bringing our show to you all in this brand new format. If you haven't heard Radio Reversal before, we are a weekly political education talk show produced and presented on Yuggera and Turrbal country in Magan-djin, so-called Brisbane, on the glorious radical radio station 4ZZZ. We've been on the airwaves in Brizzy since 2012, can you believe it? And we're thrilled to be finally sharing what we do with you all. This week I am bringing you the first in a kind of new, transformed, updated version of the Radio Reversal podcast. If you've been listening for a few years, you'll know that we as a production collective have focused on standalone research-based series. We've looked at collaboration with Justice for Palestine Magan-djin that created a kind of audio archive of the first 2 years of the ongoing struggle against Israeli genocide in Gaza. And we followed that up with a series, an ongoing series on the politics of crisis and emergency in the conditions of colonization. But we're undergoing a bit of a transformation because after a really long time on air, we've been picked up as a show for national syndication through the Community Radio Network, which means that weekly we'll be turning our regular radio show into a 30-minute segment to go out nationally. And we figured this was a pretty good opportunity to also start sharing those shows weekly as podcasts. So this is the sort of first foray into Radio Reversal as a weekly podcast. We hope that you'll consider adding us to your weekly rotation. We will be updating episodes weekly from now on. So if you're not already a subscriber to the Radio Reversal podcast, please do jump over. We've migrated from Substack over to a slightly less complicit platform on Ghost. So if you subscribed on Substack, that's completely fine. Your subscription details will all be the same. You'll still get the emails through our new platform. But if you jump over to radioreversal.org, you also have the option now of signing up as a paid subscriber. If you'd like to support the work we do and you'd like to see us doing more of this kind of stuff, we'd love to have some more time and resources to put into radical audio production. You can do that by heading to Ghost, and if you do that in the next month, you'll also get a cute little packet of zines and stickers and posters from the last 10 years of Radio Reversal, the show. So this week I'm sharing a podcast version of a conversation that we recorded a couple of weeks ago here in Magan-djin between Rouba Rayan, Anna Reynolds and Phil Mansour as part of Justice for Palestine Magan-djin's public meeting regarding the new Fighting Anti-Semitism and Keeping Guns Out of the Hands of Terrorists and Criminals Amendment Act, which was passed into Queensland Parliament in March this year. If you haven't been following, this is the show for you. We dig into the legislation itself. How it's likely to be implemented, what some of the jargony bits of the legislation mean. But to give you the broad strokes, in March this year, after a little bit of media commentary around it, the LNP coalition government introduced a swathe of new legislations or amendments to existing legislation, the most notable of which were a new prohibited expressions offence in the criminal code, which explicitly criminalises the use of two expressions, two groups of words. For the purposes of education, those two groups of words are from the river to the sea and globalise the Intifada. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that are really important about that, not least the reminder that we really have taken a big leap back into 1984, both in the Orwellian sense and in the Joh Bjelke-Petersen here in Queensland sense. But the other thing that's important is that in the Queensland Criminal Code now, in the offence that is to use a prohibited expression, it is very clear that only those two expressions in that precise format fall foul of the legislation, right? And this is important because even in the weeks since this public meeting and even in the weeks since we made these original radio shows, we've already seen Queensland Police misusing these particular provisions and arresting people for crimes that don't exist, like using a similar phrase. So Action Ready here in Queensland have been doing some absolutely excellent work as legal observers on the ground, looking at the way these new offences are being charged by the Queensland Police and a lot of the already existing misuses that we've seen. So most recently, we saw someone who was carrying a sign that said "From the sea to the river, Palestine will live forever," warned that they were likely to be charged. And when the protester said, well, that's not lawful, that's not what the legislation says, the police referenced the wrong part of the legislation in saying, oh, well, actually, it's also unlawful to use a phrase similar to the prohibited expressions, which was true in earlier drafts of the legislation, but is not true in the legislation as it was passed in Queensland Parliament. So that's really important because what we've seen is that the Queensland Police are already acting beyond the remit of these new laws and that there is widespread misunderstanding about what they mean. So all of that and more in this episode. There's lots to dig into. I'm not going to lie, there'll be points where it's going to feel quite technocratic in there. There's a lot of really detailed analysis of this legislation. But as Phil points out in the conversation between Anna Reynolds and Rouba Rayan on the night, this kind of level of understanding is really important because we do need to equip ourselves to respond to these kinds of legislative attacks, which, let's be honest, that's what they are. These are very clearly attacks on the Palestine liberation movement. But it is worth understanding how the legislation works because, as Anna Reynolds, one of the organisers of Action Ready and a lawyer who works in the criminal courts every day, points out, one of the big problems with this legislation is that even if you are arrested completely wrongly because the police have completely misunderstood this law, even if you have a really legitimate reason for using that expression, which the criminal code lists, there are many legitimate reasons to use these expressions, including for the purposes of education, for legitimate artistic purposes, and even if you are in no way using the expression to cause menace or in a way that could reasonably be understood as causing offence or harm to a member of the public, which is the other constituent element of this offence. Even in that instance, you will still have to defend yourself against the charge in court. So even if you have a legitimate reason, the onus is on you to prove that. It's not the presumption that you have a legitimate reason. The presumption is that unless you can prove in a court of law that you have a legitimate reason, these expressions are banned. So There's a lot to dig into this week, but I'm really stoked to be sharing this conversation with you as a way to kind of get a better sense of what's going on with this legislation, how it interacts with the changes to federal law that we've seen over the past couple of months. And in fact, the past couple of years since October 7, 2023. And I guess to start doing some of the work of pulling apart exactly what's going on from a legal perspective and what that demands of us as a political movement. So there is lots to be getting on with, and we're going to jump right in. You are listening to the Radio Reversal podcast. We're thrilled to have you with us. A reminder, if you haven't already, please do head over to radioreversal.org to subscribe. Make sure you never miss an episode. If you sign up in April, there is a swathe of special goodies coming your way. We'd love to have you on board. You can sign up for either a free or a paid subscription. We would be stoked to have you either way. And we're very much looking forward to building our listenership over the next couple of months. Also, a side note that this week's episode is coming out on a Monday, in part because the community up here in so-called Queensland is organising the Not Our Laws campaign in protest against the amendments that we're talking about in this week's episode. Today, April 13th, is the day that we're calling on people all across the state and indeed the country to express their dissent with the Queensland state government and these new laws. So an invitation to share this episode around, encourage other people to listen to it, put it out there however you can, write your own posts, record your own videos, do everything you can do, share around content, make sure people have a sense of what's going on with this legislation and give people a meaningful opportunity to express their dissent. A lot of people in Queensland don't even know that these legislative changes have been introduced and certainly haven't been given any tools to understand what that means. Mainstream media has reported to some degree on these changes, but certainly not to the extent that we would hope. So it would be excellent to see as many of you as possible jumping on the Not Our Laws campaign, writing to your local members and putting pressure on them in the electoral sense, but also, and much more importantly, organising within your communities to build the kinds of infrastructures that can challenge this kind of legislation, figuring out some ways to subvert and resist in small and big ways, and building communities of struggle to combat this kind of creeping, encroaching fascism in every corner where it takes root. So follow the Not Our Laws campaign, get involved however you can, and join us at radioreversal.org for the ride. So for listeners who I guess haven't necessarily been following Queensland politics too closely over the past couple of years, you might not know about some of the stuff that we're going to dig into today. In 2024, the LNP coalition took power in Queensland with a pretty significant majority. And not to go to Year 7 social studies on you, but if you have forgotten this, Queensland is kind of unusual because it's the only state in Australia that is a unicameral legislature. So that means it doesn't have an upper house. It's just the one house of parliament. And basically that means in practice that there's basically no oversight of political decisions in Queensland. If you have a majority government, any legislation that the government wants to pass, it can pass. So for the past couple of years, we've seen the LNP coalition use this benefit of a unicameral system to pass some truly bonkers legislation with honestly quite devastating consequences. And this week we are sharing our recording from a community meeting hosted by Justice for Palestine Magan-djin and Action Ready Queensland, which looks in particular at a really absurd piece of legislation passed in Queensland in March. It's the Fighting Anti-Semitism and Keeping Guns Out of the Hands of Terrorists and Criminals Amendment Act, which was passed into law on the 5th of March this year. The legislation, as you'll hear in the discussion we're playing this week, does a whole bunch of things. Fighting anti-Semitism is not one of them. And perhaps the most disturbing thing it does is that it creates a new criminal offence in the Queensland Criminal Code for using what is called a quote-unquote prohibited expression. It lists 2 such expressions in the legislation. So in the Criminal Code in Queensland now, there are 2 expressions that are prohibited for the purposes of education in this broadcast. Those banned statements are, I quote, "from the river to the sea" and "globalise the Intifada." And now those 2 expressions, in their most literal form, exactly as I've said them, are effectively banned in Queensland if saying them could reasonably be understood as causing menace to a member of the public. In case you thought you'd taken a big step back into 1984, it actually gets worse. Because already we've seen the Queensland Police taking the widest possible definition of these phrases to effectively censor pro-Palestinian speech in Queensland, despite the fact that the law very clearly only prohibits these specific phrases, and only in circumstances where they could reasonably be said to be causing menace to a member of the public. If you're listening and you're not in Queensland and you're thinking, oh, well, this doesn't really matter to me because, you know, I don't live in Queensland and things seem pretty wacky up there, take this as your invitation to think again, because one thing that we know very clearly is that what gets normalised up here will very quickly trickle south. And so it's worth paying attention to the ways that the government in Queensland is rapidly expanding the kind of carceral and colonial frameworks for dealing with dissent, because be assured that those processes will be replicated in other states and territories. And it's also worth noting that there are long and proud traditions of resistance here in so-called Queensland that have always been dedicated to uprooting the kind of state apparatus from its roots. There's a strong tradition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander resistance organising in Queensland, and this, I think, is really it creates a really fertile place from which to understand political dynamics across the continent. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into this week's episode of Radio Reversal here on the Community Radio Network, where we're going to be hearing from 3 speakers at a recent public meeting. This was recorded by Radio Reversal producer Roshan. The first voice you're going to hear is Justice for Palestine Magan-djin organiser Phil Mansour.
Tonight, we really want people to walk out of here with as clear as possible an understanding of the climate that we're in, how we continue our struggle for Palestine both strategically and effectively. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to Anna. We're going to start with the focus on the state laws, because we need to be clear that we are facing legislative confrontations on our 2 levels of government. So we have Anna as part of Action Ready, but also a solicitor who supported many people in various protests over this current period and prior to that as well. And to give us a bit of an understanding of the federal legislation, we have Rouba Rayan, who's one of the Palestinian lawyers and a prominent Palestinian leader in this city. I guess we're going to start with both of you and ask about just a basic overview of both the federal and state legislation. So if you could start with your overview of the new legislation, what information we have about phrases and symbols, and give us an understanding of that.
Yeah, so I'm starting with the state legislation, but the federal legislation is also enforced in Queensland by the Queensland Police. So it's some differences between the legislation and some overlaps, so it's very confusing. It's confusing for us, it's going to be confusing for the police a bit as well. They seem keen on the state legislation based on today. So we're going to give you a bunch of general information about how we think the laws may operate and what they say today. But everyone's individual circumstances will be different. So if the laws end up impacting you in any way, make sure you go and get some personalised legal advice. Places like Legal Aid, ATSLs if you're First Nations, community legal centres, and hopefully we may have some suggested referrals for private lawyers as well. So get in contact with JFP or Action Ready if you are needing advice in the coming months. In terms of the new offences relating to the use of prohibited expressions, it's essentially a funnel, I guess, is a good way to think about it. So it casts the net very broadly initially. And so that's any person who publicly recites, distributes, publishes, or publicly displays a prohibited expression. So that's the first step. And that's a very broad net because this idea of public is much broader than you might first think. This right now is public. A ticketed event is public. It's basically anywhere that a member of the public can access, even if that's by invitation, even if that's a private location where the public can generally come and go, like a shop or whatever else. So it has a really broad scope. That also includes online spaces, so public Facebook pages, but arguably even groups that the public can join if they have a link. So I'm thinking various group chats that people use where they might distribute links to that. All of those are potentially considered public places. It is not, criminal laws don't apply retrospectively, but the issue is that they talk about this idea of publicly displaying. And so displaying is an ongoing action. So if you think about when you publish a social media post, if you did that 6 months ago, you couldn't be charged for publishing it because that was prior to the laws coming in. But if the post is still up, it is currently being displayed on your social media. And so it is very broad in terms of the immediate effect of this law. The phrases that they have prohibited are "from the river to the sea" and "globalise the intifada." They initially, when they introduced the bill, were saying that phrases that closely resemble those would also be affected, but the final legislation that was passed is explicitly just those phrases. So that, might give a bit of wriggle room, I guess. The next step in the chain, which is theoretically is supposed to narrow it, so you cast the net broad and then sort of filter it down a bit, is that the way you post it or publish or distribute or whatever might reasonably be expected to cause a member of the public to feel menaced, harassed or offended. Now the problem with this is that the government has already decided that these are offensive phrases, even though we know that's not the case. And so even though the police will have to prove that you displayed it in a way that would reasonably expect a member of the public to feel those things, the state clearly thinks that that's reasonable. And based on actions today, they're not waiting around to choose the most offensive time that somebody says these things. They're just decided we've got enough to go straight away. So I think, I was mildly surprised. But anyway, that's something that the cops have to prove. The third step then is something that you would have to prove. And so that's that you have a reasonable excuse for having used the phrase in that way. They don't close the definition of reasonable excuse, so it could be other things, but they provide examples of what a reasonable excuse might be. And so that's where you published, displayed, distributed for a genuine artistic, religious, educational, historical, legal or law enforcement purpose. So, songs, art, things like that, you might be able to raise the defence. Me telling you what the phrases were just now, that's educational. So often it's quite common for the law to have carve-outs for satire and artistic purposes and things like that. So this is kind of within that framing, which the law is kind of used to dealing with. There is also if you display it for a purpose that is in the public interest. For example, a genuine political purpose or in a genuine public dispute, which arguably anybody using these phrases, especially in protest contexts, would be able to raise that defence. The difficulty is that the police may charge you and you have to prove the defence. And so, maybe everybody gets out of these charges, but it's obviously being charged can have a really big impact on people's lives in very many different ways.
That was Anna Reynolds speaking at the Justice for Palestine Magan-djin public meeting in March this year. We're going to pick up that recording as Palestinian lawyer and activist Rouba Rayan begins to talk us through some of the new federal laws that have been implemented since October 7, 2023.
I'm actually not going to talk about the newly introduced federal laws immediately. I'm going to start with ones that most people don't know about that were introduced in 2024. And they were in response to October 7. So it's the advocate or threaten violence against a protected group. And if the advocacy, advocating for violence or the threatening of violence was aimed at a child, then there's the factor of aggravation. And then we also have the use of force or property damage at a place of worship or against a protected group. And then there's, we all know the display prohibited symbols and the associating with a prohibited hate group, like they're the ones that were quite widely spoken about late last year and early this year. But the advocate or threatening violence or use of force or property damage against a protected group, these offences relate to when a person, if you go to a synagogue or if you are threatening a spiritual or religious official, or if the recipient of the advocacy is a child, then these are quite so if you are convicted of these offences, it's either a 7 to 10 year prison sentence. Nobody is going to be advocating for violence, but we don't actually know what constitutes advocating for violence. And there are a lot of people who where those, there was that chant that was at Glastonbury last year that everybody knows, that it was very popular, and it was made into a shirt. Now that could constitute advocating violence, right? And the group that, they chanted about could be considered a protected group because of the religion that they follow, ignoring the fact that they belong to an army that is accused of committing genocide. Right, so I don't want to put the fear of God into people, but I also want people to be aware that what they wear, even if it seems, innocent or funny, or it could constitute, and you may not get convicted, but you will likely be charged. And that's an inconvenience in itself, right? So you need to be really careful. Then there's the display a prohibited hate symbol, and they initially related to the Nazi swastika, but after October 7, the Hamas, Al-Qassam Brigade and Hezbollah flags all became prohibited hate symbols. And this one is quite, you need to be really careful, because if you display the hate symbol, it carries a mandatory 12-month jail sentence. So this means that the court does not carry any discretion to suspend the sentence, right? They may be able, as Anna and I were discussing, be able to lessen, like make it a lighter sentence, maybe 9, you have to serve 9 out of the 12 months, but it's unlikely. And these are absolute liability offences. So this is very similar to the traffic infringement offences. When you get a traffic fine, you can say, I didn't mean to speed, your officer, and the officer's going to go, I don't care, you were speeding, you're going to get a fine, because they're strict liability offences. And so what your intent was does not matter. It's the fact that you displayed or disseminated the symbol in a way that the targeted group finds offensive. Right? So Yeah, and currently the Hamas flag, the Al-Qassam Brigade flag and Hezbollah flags are all banned. There is a list of prescribed terrorist organizations, so any terrorist organization, you can't display their symbols, and it can be found on the Federal Attorney General's website.
So the laws are targeted slightly differently. So what is the new hate group legislation, and how does a individual work out what groups are prescribed as a hate group?
Yeah. So section 114.A of the Criminal Code, because anyone other than a lawyer would know what that is, states, and this is honestly what it says, a prohibited hate group is an entity that has been listed as one by the Australian government. So basically it's just by prescription. So, for example, the Criminal Code defines a hate group as an organisation that is specified by a regulation, and the regulation has only designated one group currently. And Ramadan Mubarak, Hizb al-Tahrir, which is is the group that they've decided to designate, just in time for Ramadan, so that anyone that wants to go to a mosque that is Hizb al-Tahrir mosque can't go. It's going to impact people's lives quite significantly. Now, the thing about these laws is there was all this talk about retrospective laws when the federal government introduced the laws. But what is retrospective is not, so once a group is considered a hate group, then associating with that group is a crime, right? Having associated with the group prior to them being a prescribed hate group is not an offence. However, the government can use statements by the organisation that were made prior to the legislation to designate them as a hate group. And these offences under the new hate group laws carry a maximum penalty of between 7 and 15 years imprisonment. So, look, they're big sentences, but that's the maximum penalties. It's not, we don't know what they're going to give, because these laws haven't been tested yet.
I think have you covered violent extremist material in its definition? I think the state of social media and the internet at the moment means, and I would encourage people to be very considered about what they do share and check sources very carefully. But what is the violent extremist material, and what are the penalties for online sharing?
Yeah, so this one's very interesting because the legislation was introduced very soon after October 7, and it was done quietly by the then Federal Attorney General, and it was advocated quite heavily for by the Federal Police. I didn't even know that this legislation existed until last year, when a young Palestinian boy was charged with criminal offences under these legislation, because he'd shared a few videos of the H group, putting blowing up tanks, the big tanks that the IDF roll through Gaza. Now, we don't actually know what constitutes extremist violent material, because it could be something as innocuous as an Al Jazeera video, with the analyst Dweri. Right? It could be something that innocuous, or it could be, videos that are created by the H group for release. But right now, these laws are not defined. The legislation is unclear, and the AFP have failed to provide comprehensive information on what constitutes violent extremist material. What I would recommend is, if you're not sure, don't share it. Because there are factors of aggravation. So if you share it with a child who's under the age of 18, then it's a heftier penalty. Again, this is absolute liability laws. So there is, so your intent does not matter. Whether you thought you were sharing like a news report, or, you know, you were cheering it on, it doesn't matter. It's absolute liability, and so you could be potentially facing serious charges if you share videos that may constitute violent extremist material.
Okay, so I guess you've started talking about protection and people being considered about how they do post, but can you explain a little bit more of a strategy for protection?
Yeah, so cleanse your phone as often as possible. I have put my phone in lockdown mode, so anything that's shared with me, I actually have to actively go and look at what's been shared. So put your phone into lockdown mode. Use messaging apps with really good encryption and disappearing messages. And any new group chat that you start, I like 24-hour disappearing messages, but most people tend to go for 4 weeks, and make it so that it's not optional, so that the other person, it disappears for them as well. I mean, you know, you're going to go ask your partner to buy some milk on the way home. You can use your regular text messaging app, but if you're going to discuss or plan, you know, going to a rally, or maybe you're frustrated about what's happening in the world, do that on a private messaging app that no one can see, with disappearing messages. That way you're protecting yourself, and do it with people you trust.
That was Rouba Rayan, a Palestinian lawyer and organiser, talking us through some of the new amendments introduced federally since 2023, and I guess what they mean for pro-Palestinian protest in this moment. We're going to end this week's podcast episode with Anna Reynolds from Action Ready up here in Magan-djin, again talking us through, but now in, I guess, more practical terms, some of the additional police powers that have been introduced in the new legislation here in Queensland, and what these kinds of changes to the criminal code and the introduction of these new offences, what they're likely to mean in practice for how police interact with pro-Palestinian protesters.
Phil has also asked me to address the expansion of police powers. And I think it's worth saying that police already have a lot of powers, and you know, they typically use them against communities who have been resisting in this place since colonisation began. And this is just the latest sort of expansion into the new group of people that they've decided they wish to target. So the main expansion is around search powers. And it's now the case that police can search you, your stuff, your car, if they reasonably suspect that you have committed one of these offences. They don't need to be looking for evidence, they just have to reasonably suspect you've committed one of these offences, and then they don't require a warrant to search you. Whether this, you know, opens up the chance that police might just search anyone who looks like they advocate for Palestine, don't know, but I think it's a real risk. What we suggest is, if police are wanting to search you, you should always say, I don't consent, can you tell me why you have a lawful reason to search me? That's a bit of a mouthful. You can just say, oh, are you allowed? That's also fine. Or like, oh, can you tell me like why you're allowed? And then make sure you really clearly say, I don't consent to it, but you say that you can, so I'm not going to resist, because you don't want to end up in a position where they use force to do that search. But one of the reasons a search will become lawful is if you consent to it. So it's really clear just to put on record that you're not consenting.
Very clear that not all talks are going to follow this law.
Yes, absolutely. So always assess the risk in the moment. Some cops are going to be way shovier than others, and if you don't have anything on you that you're concerned about anyway, you know, look after yourself and just go, okay, sure, like, always just be wary. And when you're heading along to protests and when you're out in public wearing keffiyeh, I think now it's important before you leave home every day to make sure you don't have something on you that you wouldn't want police to find. And so that's like pocket knives, that's prescription drugs if you don't have your prescription. That's prescription drugs even if you do have it. Sometimes that might open up risk for you, unless of course you have to have it with you. Police maintain all their existing powers to seize evidence of the commission of an offence. This is something they might use to seize people's phones if they think that the phone will have stuff in it that helps them prove these offences. For example, the phone might assist with proving that, you know, your purpose wasn't genuine when you used the expression or when you displayed the symbol, for example. While they can take things that they think are evidence of an offence, they will need a warrant to require your password for your phone or your laptop or whatever else. So you don't have to hand that over if cops ask for it. They need to have a court order. But if they have that order, it's very serious not to comply with it. So, you know, this is, again, like Rouba, I don't want to put the fear of God into you, but it's useful to know these things when you can sort of, what you should say back to them and when you can say no. And yeah, sorry, I should have said, if you're in a public place, absolutely film the police, and while you're interacting with them, continue filming. It can feel a bit uncomfortable, but just fight through that politeness and keep filming and say, I'm filming this. They'll say, my body-worn camera's on, and you can say, okay, I'm going to keep filming.
But beyond those things, if you don't have a lawyer present with you, just shut the fuck up, please. Just, how you going? Just shut the fuck up. How's your mum? Just don't engage, right? Sorry.
The other one worth mentioning is they need a warrant to search your home. So I've just been talking about searching your person and searching your bag and things like that. Yeah, that's it.
So that's a bit of an overview of all the essential parts of the law. So what are the consequences of being charged and the nature of the offence, sentencing options, and what impact it will have on people's ability to work?
So both of these new state offences carry a maximum penalty of 2 years imprisonment. That doesn't mean you will get 2 years imprisonment. It depends on everybody's individual circumstances. So I think it's worth having a think about where you're at in your life. How at risk are you from interactions with the criminal legal system? And so that's thinking, do I already have a criminal history? Because that's something that would be taken into account. If you're charged and found guilty and they're deciding a sentence, they will look at previous history. If you need a blue card or a yellow card for work, even charges alone can impact you. That doesn't mean you're going to have it taken off you. There are lots of people who've engaged in protest activity and been charged with things related to protest who have kept their blue cards, but there are also people who have had them suspended while having to fight to keep it, and in that time not being able to work. So those are the sorts of things worth thinking about. If you're on an insecure visa, or any visa really, does it raise issues for you in relation to the character test? And is there a risk of your visa being cancelled? Everybody's circumstances are going to be really different. You know, if you're neurodiverse or gender diverse and interactions with police and those systems put you at a higher level of risk, something worth thinking about too. So it's a sort of self-assessment of where you're at in terms of your risk of exposure to charges, but also if it were to proceed on to an actual sentence. And so sentencing, they're taking into account all sorts of circumstances. These ones would go through the magistrates' court, and magistrates have a diverse range of views when it comes to engaging in protest. And some will see that as a reason to mitigate, as in lower your sentence, and some will see it as a reason to increase your sentence. There's not a clearly settled position on whether, you know, protest should be seen as a reason to lower. Arguably, the Human Rights Act, which does protect our right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, should assist in those circumstances, but it's not always seen to play out that way. I think Action Ready has observed over many years patterns of policing where they will target organisers because they think that if they do that, the protest will fall apart, or the gathering or the event or the movement itself will fall apart, which of course it doesn't, because there's no, one lead as everybody is contributing. But there are people who appear to be sort of leaders, and they may be at higher risk. It is also possible in Queensland to charge someone with procuring a person to commit an offence, which is sort of like encouraging in a way. It goes a little bit further than encouraging, but that might put someone at higher risk if you're in a rally and you're on the megaphone and you're encouraging everyone around you to chant, whether they would look at that as a circumstance of aggravation or an entirely separate charge for procuring. You can also be charged with conspiring to commit an offence, but it's getting complicated, and the laws are already so complicated. I think the police are probably going to choose the easier targets and the easier circumstances.
You are listening to Radio Reversal. We've been broadcasting an excerpt from a community meeting this week, hosted by Justice for Palestine Magan-djin. This public meeting was digging into some legislation passed here in Queensland titled the Fighting Anti-Semitism and Keeping Guns Out of the Hands of Terrorists and Criminals Amendment Act. And we've been getting our heads around what this means in practice for Palestinian solidarity organising here on this continent. If you've got questions after listening to today's conversation about the Justice for Palestine movement here in Magan-djin, or the kinds of mobilising that's happened over the past few years, or more broadly about the history of Palestinian resistance and the ongoing struggle for self-determination, for land back, and for liberation from Israeli colonial occupation, the Radio Reversal podcast has a standalone series co-produced with Justice for Palestine Magan-djin, which delves really deeply into the history of the Palestinian struggle for liberation. We spent almost 2 years recording rallies and protests, public meetings, community discussion groups, all sorts of things. And from that archive, we drew together a podcast series that explores some of the key themes around the Palestinian liberation movement, as well as the struggle here in the context of ongoing colonization on this continent. So we're going to be continuing our analysis of this legislation over the coming months. And for those of you who are listening and you're not based in Queensland and you're wondering, maybe this is relevant for me, maybe it's not. I think the reason that I think these conversations are so vital is because understanding the mechanisms through which the state attempts to restrict and restrain and curtail political expression on this continent is really crucial to building effective resistance to it. And I wanted to, end this week's program with the invitation to think about the long tradition of restricting forms of resistance and protest, of limiting the ability of people to speak truth to power in this continent. I'm speaking, of course, from so-called Queensland, with its own long history of repressive state governments using a variety of laws to criminalise different forms of protest. But across the continent, there are examples of the criminalisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people speaking both their traditional languages, but also speaking about the self-determination and land rights that they've long demanded. And I think this is really important as a grounding for these conversations now. It's not to say that there is nothing new to be seen here, and it's not to say that this isn't a really important political turn that we need to pay close attention to, but it is to say that there are long, deep histories of both repression and resistance that can really shape how we approach these conversations in the present present moment. And this is something that I hope for listeners who are new to Radio Reversal, it's something I hope that our show can help provide, is some of those deeper histories that sit underneath legislation like this, that help animate it, that create the bedrock on which it becomes possible for a state government to implement legislation effectively prohibiting a sequence of words devoid of all context, devoid of all meaning, and to get away with it. So keep listening to Radio Reversal over the next couple of weeks, and we'll be digging in different ways back into the sort of interrelated set of questions and dynamics that come up once we scratch the surface of politics here in the colony. That's all we've got time for this week on Radio Reversal, but I wanted to end with the reminder that these laws are in action now. Already this week we've seen protesters carrying signs with similar but very different wording to the prohibited expressions, told that they should probably remove their signs because they may be in breach of the legislation. We've seen artists issued with threats that works displayed that again do not contain the prohibited expressions but contain similar wording to the prohibited expressions, have been told to censor their work or remove it from public places. We've seen a dramatic overreach on the part of the police already in their implementation of these laws, and this comes as no surprise to anyone who's been watching what's happening in Queensland over the past few years. These kinds of overreaches are already happening and the law has only been in effect for a few weeks. So it's really important for all of us, not just here in Queensland, but across the country, to get a good sense of the ways that the government is attempting to restrict the freedom of speech of pro-Palestinian protesters, as well as the ways that these kinds of legislative implements are almost certainly going to expand further and further if we don't collectively mobilise against them. So that's it for the Radio Reversal podcast for this week. Thank you, as always, for listening in. We have stacks more to come on the Radio Reversal podcast over the next couple of weeks, so make sure you do subscribe. And if you keep your ears open for next week's episode, you'll hear a really important conversation with Dr. Raylene Nixon, who is an academic and a researcher, a Gungari woman whose beloved son, Stevie Lee, was killed in police custody in Toowoomba in 2021. Raylene and her family have been fighting for justice for Stevie Lee and for some answers from the Queensland Police Service about what happened the night Stevie Lee died. I have a long chat with Raylene coming up on next week's episode, where we talk a little bit about her experiences navigating the coronial inquest into Stevie Lee's death and the ongoing campaign to push the Queensland Police for accountability and answers into the tragic death of her beloved boy. You're listening to the Radio Reversal podcast. Until next week,